I am here with my good friend Kiara Bickers, who is the author of Bitcoin Clarity, a book I find to be one of the most comprehensive books about Bitcoin that is currently out. Also, very much like the cover, the tulip is a nice touch. And it covers a very wide range of topics in a way that is not pedantic, but also detailed enough to get your fill of the technicals. But more importantly, the book focuses on why, not the how. So you come away from it understanding why Bitcoin does certain things the way that it does, without being bogged down by like, this is exactly how the algorithm functions, because not the majority of the public who is interested in Bitcoin isn't ever going to get to that level of understanding anyways. And to be honest, that's not the most important thing about Bitcoin. Now, it's been, you didn't write this too long ago, but I know we were saying how we oscillate between like very bullish on Bitcoin and then being kind of like exhausted because so much happens in such a small span of time. How do you feel right now?
Well, right now I'm sort of in a I think it's a good place, but it's sort of like a more balanced place. So I think one of the things that causes this hype and lull cycles is that we all want to contribute, especially the people who have been very convinced about this technology. You want to find some way you can contribute to Bitcoin, and there aren't necessarily a lot of ways to do that. And what I thought back in like 2017, 18, when I started writing this book is like, what is the big problem for Bitcoin that I could help solve? And I saw it being the complete misunderstanding that non-technical people were having about Bitcoin. We see this all the time in the media where like Bitcoin is either demonized, or if you recall like the Bitcoin Cash fork, it's like, sure, the people who learn through experience eventually understand what Bitcoin is, but the new wave of people in every hype cycle don't learn. They don't learn in any like comprehensive way. They only learn through the experience of like, like these ICOs sound a lot like DeFis. That's interesting that this has happened twice. Right? So there's a lot of weird stuff in the industry that I wanted to document in this book, as well as take people from the understanding of like, okay, you're interested in Bitcoin. This is why Bitcoin could potentially be useful. But even if you're sold on that vision, you can't really believe it unless you understand just enough of the how. The problem in a lot of the like overly technical ways of explaining Bitcoin is they assume that people need to know elliptic curve cryptography and basically all of cryptography and then all of the history of Bitcoin, which I think is excessive. Or like you'll see like a private key converted into binary, as if that helps anybody.
Yeah, you can teach someone about like the Byzantine problem without like drawing the math for it. Like
I don't even use the word term for it here.
Yeah.
And it's not a dumbing down, it's simply just the way I think about it and the way that I learned to explain it, and I structure the book this way, is I call it systems thinking, and I break it down between analytical, low-level stuff, and then synthetic thinking, which is like bigger picture outside of the system stuff. So that would include things like governments, economies, the financial system, the market, just why you are individually interested in Bitcoin. And then when we go into the technicals, it talks about everything from locks so that you can understand cryptography. Because, Bitcoin, when you're sending and receiving transactions, that's really just unlocking and locking. I had never had it explained to me that way. It took me years of being in the Bitcoin space before it was explained to me that way. All the way down into opcode, so that someone who's new to the industry can actually understand the progress of developer conversations. Awesome. If there is any, which there isn't right now.
All right, we'll start with the negatives. So there are some negatives you point out in the book, which, you said earlier, like, there's a lot of copium and the
Hopium.
Hopium, yeah.
Yeah, copium is a funny one, too.
Copium is good, too, yeah.
Copium.
That's mine now, okay.
Okay.
And, like I said, like, I oscillate between being incredibly pumped and psyched about Bitcoin and its potential to being kind of disillusioned and feeling like I overestimated its effects. And, yeah, that's just the way it's been. I'm used to it now. So, let's start with the negatives.
Well, I think in the early days of Bitcoin, I was interested maybe like 2012. It really did feel like sharing the news about Bitcoin, you were doing something that was helping, right? Because people had never heard of it before. And they're like, oh, what's this interesting thing called Bitcoin? And like, you'd send them some Bitcoin and get them involved, and like, they'd learn about it. But now everyone has heard about Bitcoin. Everyone already has their sort of cemented view on it. And the only time someone changes their view is when Bitcoin hits new all-time highs. Now, of course, that's going to make anyone disillusioned. Like, that's horrible. But that's, I mean, I've heard so many stories of people selling their house to buy cryptocurrency, or like, right, your eyes just go, what? Or like putting on their credit cards all the stuff to buy Bitcoin, or we've seen people lose money at the top. So there's like all these horrible stories because people bought into the hopium, but they didn't understand what they were doing.
I actually know a lot of stories that are the opposite. Like, people didn't have the hopium, but they were in early, so they bought at like $3 and sold at $100, and
those
bought a
were
house.
The stories between 2012 and 2017.
Right. All these people are gone. Like, they are not participating in Bitcoin anymore. So now it's the opposite effect. Like, it's the bought in high effect, which really hurts people. Don't do that.
Yeah, I think it was like a libertarian YouTuber that I was watching, and he was talking about how like, oh, cryptocurrency should do really well because the economy is doing so poorly. And, you know, that was sort of the assumption way back when. But now it's like, because Bitcoin is so, I guess, overbought by industry participants, even after coronavirus, we saw a huge crash in the price because it was all these people who were putting their money into Bitcoin as a speculative asset, not as a hedge against the dollar, which is what like you would say like OG Bitcoiners were interested in, right? But it's a totally different ecosystem now. I don't think that necessarily disillusions me. I think there's still I think it's still undervalued in the long term, but that's when you get into talking about time preference and stuff, right?
There is kind of a saying in the space that you don't lose money unless you sell, which is a very long time preference attitude. And that's the attitude I've always had. And no matter at what time you bought in, if you have that attitude and you're not desperate for cash flow, then you'll be okay. But with the new Bitcoiners, that's generally not it. They are looking at it as a speculation.
Right. And like, what we got interested in Bitcoin, the reason we got interested in Bitcoin early on was because we viewed it as a more ethical alternative to fiat.
Yeah.
Right. And if you don't share that view and you're just looking at it as like, I'm putting a tip on a fast pony, like, of course you're going to, one, look like a fool, and two, like, you don't fit in, you don't really understand like what the rest of the community, and it is a very strong community, like, thinks about Bitcoin. You just kind of like buy into the hype of it with not the fundamental principles.
So are you still positive about that aspect of Bitcoin?
The fundamental principles? Yes. 100%. Even if
they
Bitcoin
haven't
failed.
changed. That's the beautiful thing about Bitcoin. It hasn't really changed.
Right.
It makes the way Bitcoin is structured, it's incredibly difficult to change it. And if you do change it, you can still use the old protocol. So technically it doesn't really change.
Yeah, so I cover that in a section of this book called Governance, where I talk about like what the average person thinks governance is in terms of the governmental systems that we live under, like how you have, this is my personal opinion, but I think the reason why the United States is able to have a bit more freedom than other places is because we have a more decentralized way of doing our government, as opposed to like European countries and stuff like that, or communist countries, God forbid. And I use that as a comparison for how Bitcoin Core as like a system actually gets code implemented and changed and updated. How it's very difficult. It's harder than passing laws.
Yeah, it's like the tree ants. Just a couple more years, guys. We'll get it done.
There's so many problems, but I mean,
there's problems, but
it's probably overall a good thing that it's hard to push new stuff.
If it's fundamentally good, then it's fundamentally good that it's hard to change the fundamentally good thing.
Yes.
So I'm okay with it. That's great.
It just means that there's like less stuff going on in the development community, but I think that that's probably also just good.
Yeah.
Oh, look, we found something good to say.
So let's define like why Bitcoin is a more moral money or system. I like to call it a system.
Yeah. Because
it's not just money. That is the component of the overall system of Bitcoin. And for me, it's a monetary system that isn't based on lies, and inflation is lies and theft. So it's a monetary system that's not based on lies and theft, basically. With what we have currently, because currencies are not backed by hard assets such as gold, people can just make more money when they want to, which means that they are dead enslaving the future generation. And eventually, that inflation hits a point where things collapse, and then you just have nothing left. And that country where the currency collapses has to start over. And we were talking earlier how, because of how globalized things have become, if that happens to a big country like America, a lot of cascading effects will occur. So it's not like...
it's hard to predict.
Yeah, it's not like, oh, a small country in Europe's currency collapsed, big deal. Like, this is... The next time the currency collapses, it's going to be a really big deal.
Well, specifically the U.S., and we see this with, like, a lot of the libertarian crowd, which, you know, we love them, but there's some issues there. It's like... The simultaneous desire for Bitcoin to do well doesn't necessitate the fact that you should want the American currency to collapse. But people do view it this way. Is they're so pro Bitcoin they want the American currency to collapse, not fully understanding, like, yeah, that would make you rich, but like at what cost? Like, yeah, if you won't be able to buy toilet paper, but you'll be rich.
Yeah. I don't like the other or kind of stuff. I don't like the replacement stuff. I like the parallel stuff, and obviously things do replace each other constantly.
Can I use this word on your show? Could I use the word mold bug? Yeah, yes. There's a guy, Moldbug, who talks about this. The idea between designing your ethical system, at least in part, based on order and chaos. Would it create chaos, or would it create more order? Now, even if a system is horribly unethical, which I would argue our existing monetary system is, I think that's just plain as day to see, to collapse it and to put something in its place would be like...
That's going to be chaos, and you don't know what's going to be in its place. And if you think Bitcoin's going to step in and be like the governing currency of the new America, like, that's retarded. Sorry. But Bitcoin still, like, for me, besides all of that stuff, which is very interesting to discuss and hypothesize about, do things for, like, their moral end, right?
Yes.
So... even if Bitcoin doesn't do what you want it to do in the future, like in terms of like how vast it becomes or the price, use Bitcoin because it's the moral system. Right. That's why you use it. Everything else is a plus.
And if you have that mentality going into Bitcoin, you're going to be so much more stable-minded. You know, I don't check the price of Bitcoin every day. I check the price of Bitcoin when people...
I just look at my husband's facial expression. Like,
that's so you do check every day.
I've gotten him to stop checking every day because
it's so unhealthy.
So unhealthy. And like, he hasn't been doing the.
Think about the normies who look at their 401k every day. I don't know people like that, but I know they exist.
They exist, yes, and it's horrific. Don't do that.
Right. I mean, at least with Bitcoin, the way that I view it is not only is it a more ethical alternative to fiat, it's a way to do it peacefully.
Yes.
You're like, I reject the system that I am forced to live under, but I'm not going to tear it down. I'm just going to do my own thing over here. And, you know, in order for that to actually be done, because, of course, like, questioning power is not really tolerated, it had to be done with cryptography.
So the fact that it had to be done with cryptography, it's a vital point because it makes it the hardest money. And what we mean by hard money is money that has an inherent value and that is scarce and difficult to inflate. That's Bitcoin. It's more difficult to inflate than gold. It's more scarce than gold.
But it has a very interesting problem, which I try and solve with the book, which is if it's done with cryptography, the average person doesn't know what that means. And like when I wanted to learn about Bitcoin when I was like a student back in, I don't know, 2012 or whatever it was, I spent 2 years learning how to program in C++. And, like, I didn't actually know very much C++ after 2 years. I was like, holy shit, I'm still a noob. I know nothing. And then I would go back to the source code, and I'd be like, I have no idea. This is, like, way too complex. I guess I need to learn cryptography, too. So then I'd buy, like, a random book about cryptography. I'd read the book on cryptography, and I'd be like, holy shit, how much of this actually applies to Bitcoin? Only, like, one chapter? Like, maybe this is a criticism of my... you know, inability to put together some coursework for myself as, like, a poor autodidact. But, like... I was doing what everyone was telling me to do. It's like, oh, you want to learn about Bitcoin? You should learn how to code. And that's terrible advice. And, like, there are a lot of...
You should only learn to code if you're a journalist.
That's a funny joke.
Don't I had to.
You're going to get banned.
I agree. Yeah.
There's a lot of good books on Bitcoin that teach. Well, I'll say this. There's a lot of developer books on Bitcoin that developers don't actually read. There's a lot of good economic books on Bitcoin and, the stuff that predated Bitcoin, like talking about Austrian economics. Hayek talked a little bit about private money, which was great. I thought that was kind of like a foreshadowing for Bitcoin. And then you have like this moral avenue, which you're writing a book about that as well.
Yeah.
Right? So like these are all good. And I think, but the problem is like, imagine being someone who's younger, like it was me years ago, just reading only the programmer books or reading only the economic books, which that's what the economics professors do, right? They only read the philosophy about the economy.
That's why this is a good book.
That's why
Christmas
I wanted
list.
to do it, because it's like once I understood what systems thinking is, and I'll talk a little bit about that now, I think that's a good time. It really, really helped me frame the book. And when I brought it to the Guns and Bitcoins conference that we both went to and you were a speaker at, a guy picked it up and he was like, oh, this is laid out really well. It's like, yeah, that's because that was the whole point, was to like, someone should be able to pick up one book about the topic and understand and be walked through in an analytical way, meaning that we're going into the system, we're going to learn about cryptography, but just enough that you don't become overwhelmed. Like, we're not going to turn private keys into binary, because that's ridiculous. We're not going to teach everything about cryptography, because you don't need to know that.
It is laid out really well, and as someone who's been in the space for a long time and who's not incredibly technical but understands Bitcoin to a certain degree, like, I can go to the chapters that I need to brush up on, or that I didn't understand fully, or that I need to learn to explain better to other people. So for me, like, this is a great go-to when my friends who aren't technical at all are new to Bitcoin and they're like, hey, what's up with this? And I'm like, well, here's a short spiel, and then you can supplement what I said with actually reading this.
Right, so the way that it's organized, just to give like a high level, is it's the core of it is two parts. It's analytical thinking, which takes you inside of the system and takes the system apart and asks how questions. Like, how does this work? Well, in order to know how a car works, you have to take the pieces of the car apart and then you show how the interactions work to create combustion. Right? But if you want to ask why questions, like, why is this useful? Why was it done this way? There's a lot of stuff in Bitcoin where you're looking at it and you're like, why do all these magic numbers exist places? Like, what is the purpose of Bitcoin at one level, and like, why is it done this way? And that's a whole separate section of the book. So it's like, once you understand how Bitcoin works just enough, then I can tell you the bigger why questions of like why it's useful. Now that you have enough of the technical understanding that you can believe that the why is possible. Because if I were to just tell you like, oh, Bitcoin is this like really important decentralized cryptocurrency, like, that doesn't tell you anything.
No. Because it assumes that you agree with the person you're talking to about the problems that are inherent in the current system already. So like,
if that's another thing entirely.
Right? Yeah, and like, I actually, so when we're like almost done our book, and I actually looked to your book for our Bitcoin chapter, because the chapter was really chaotic and overwhelming.
Ooh,
so I was like, okay, I know Kiara's book isn't like that. And I just looked through it again, and I'm like, okay, we need to organize this chapter by answering what problems does Bitcoin solve in the current financial system, which is what the book was ultimately about. Like, Bitcoin is the more moral money, but why? Why is the current system immoral? So if Bitcoin is the more moral money, what immoral problems does Bitcoin solve? And that's how I ended up organizing that chapter. And
wonderful.
It was just, all the information was there, but
sure.
It was just... It makes the editing process is very important with books.
Yes.
You can have amazing information and lose the audience because you're just not like putting it out properly in an orderly fashion.
Sure. And, one of the things that I wanted to do with the book, which I don't know if all readers would appreciate, because I think some do really like to be taken in a particular direction. My personal goal was to have someone be able to read this book and then make their own judgment call. So I'm not saying like 21 million good, it's like orange coin good, green paper bad, right? It's like, I may think that, and I may admit to you that I have that bias, and I say that this is a more ethical money in these ways, but there's a great quote, I think it's by Naval, and he says, no, I'm sorry, it's a great quote, I couldn't deny it. Okay. And he says like, money is this consensus hallucination. And it's like, from that if you believe that, you can kind of open someone's mind up without like telling them what they should be hallucinating.
Sure, yeah. To me that makes me think of more fiat. Like I don't that quote to me like describes fiat really well.
It describes all money though, in my mind. So we have a difference of opinion here, but it's like if you're talking to someone who is very ingrained in their way of thinking around fiat and their 401k, and you're like, hey, there's this thing called Bitcoin, and you don't know if you share any values with them really whatsoever, I think it's a very reasonable way to approach it with them, or I shouldn't say reasonable, it's a very effective way to sort of convert those people by being like, well, you know, money isn't backed by anything, hasn't been for a long time, money is this consensus solution already, you're just bought into the hallucination. So if you can open someone's mind up like that...
Yeah, I agree with that. I would just say Bitcoin isn't that. Because it has...
Well, we all agree
it's a hard money.
But we all agree that hard money is valuable, and we agree scarcity is valuable.
For reasons.
Yeah.
The only reason people agree fiat is valuable is because the government backs it.
Yes.
Yeah. So that...
You could say scarcity is more objective than government power, but then that's a debate. That's not necessarily true.
Yeah. And I mean, people still have to trust fiat currency. Like... whether or not their government backs it, like people still have to trust it, but that's where inflation comes in. As soon as people stop trusting the currency and it inflates, like it doesn't matter what your government says, you're not going to use it. But that initial value of a fiat currency is like pretty much because the government says it is.
And my goal, just to sort of reiterate, is not to be like Bitcoin is valuable because I say it is.
Yeah, no,
I want people to think for themselves.
Way more objective. It's not prescriptive. It's just informative and pretty objective. So you're not gonna like turn people away by giving them a preachy Bitcoin book. That's the book I'm writing with some people. Stay tuned. I'll link that below when it comes out. Yeah, you'll get that. You'll get that too. But if you don't want that, Bitcoin Clarity is the better option for you.
It's a different book. People, I think they complement each other. And a lot of the books in this space.
That's why this is good. Okay, what else do we want to cover?
You're an editor of the book. I enjoyed your feedback on it.
I read book and made notes. I heard some notes were very bad and some notes were very significant.
Yeah, thanks.
So yeah, I'm just an extreme person. Take it or leave it, I guess.
Yeah, I appreciate it. You know, one of the interesting things that maybe we should do a video for my channel too. I want to talk about how like all of the women that we know in the Bitcoin space are all INTJs.
Yes.
Or ENTJs. So like we're all just like super judgmental, like, I guess.
Kiara, this is bad. You're wrong. Okay.
No fifis are hurt in the process. Yeah, I shouldn't say fifis. No feelings are hurt in the process.
I think at the same time, though, you lay out the information in a way that is kind of self-revealing. Like, this is probably a very good option in many situations, especially considering what we have today. Like, I think that's something people can get to on their own by the information you provide, because they're not buried in a lot of irrelevant things.
Yeah, which is like a major problem with trying to learn about Bitcoin coming in 2020. You know, it's not...
It's too much information.
There's more material, but in a way that actually makes it harder.
Yes.
Because I know I would get the feeling that someone's just trying to sell me something, and the chaos surrounding it would just put me off, probably.
Exactly. So, like, if you Google Bitcoin and you get a crazy negative article, a crazy positive article, a crazy bullish, a crazy bearish take.
You need to go down the rabbit hole.
This podcast, that podcast, this guy.
You need to turn this in your life and spend the next 3 years learning about Bitcoin.
There's only so deep someone's willing to dig before they're sold on something.
Right.
And it was way easier to be sold on Bitcoin in, like, 2012 than it is now, even though Bitcoin was, like, nothing.
Because it was quieter.
Yeah.
It was quieter. It was easier to ask questions. And now it's just, like... Everyone who's been in the space for so long feels that all the questions have been answered already, so like, why don't you just Google it? But it's not that simple.
No.
I think the ability to turn complexity into simplicity is a mark of intelligence, and I'm giving myself a pat on the back for that one, because I do think I try to make the system as simple as possible without dumbing it down and writing like Bitcoin for Dummies.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
That's basically my opinion on the book too.
Cool.
So, yeah, I think this is going to be a staple in our community for a while, and yeah, I'll link it below if you would like to purchase some for your non-Bitcoin friends or Bitcoin novices.
It's funny because I actually like wrote the book for people who aren't in Bitcoin, but of course it's all the Bitcoiners who buy it.
It's like that for any community, but I think it'll take a while to kind of get some traction. I think that happens with most books. Like Jimmy Song, he wrote the Little Bitcoin book with a bunch of people. And I think Elena Vernova wrote that with him. Okay. And people have reached out to him and said, like, they gave everybody in their mega church that book for Christmas.
Wow.
So and that book, I think, is 3 years old, and so it takes a little while. But I think these types of publications are kind of reaching audiences beyond just the community.
But I think all the books in the ecosystem are complementary, and I'm looking forward to reading your book when it comes out.
It's Thank God for Bitcoin, which is provocative depending on who you talk to.
No, that's good.
Do you like that?
Yeah, I do.
Thank God for Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Because the reason I like the title is it includes all the things we're talking about.
Sure.
Boom. We'll have a subtitle too. But you know what I pitched?
What?
Make money moral again.
I have a book that I should share with you. It's about the Christian duty to become as wealthy as you can so you can do the right thing with it. You'd appreciate that. And actually, I should mention, because you just reminded me, I wanted to call the book The Value of Beauty. And it would have been like Bitcoin, the value of beauty. And
it's too meta for people.
It's too meta for people, but the idea is I wanted to give the non-technical person the appreciation for Bitcoin as a system in the way the developers see it without the technical jargon. I think in a long-form dialogue like this, people can appreciate it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I just watered it down to Bitcoin clarity. So, and maybe I'll do a crypto chaos book in the future for like more history of all the different things that have happened in crypto.
I like the concept and I like the title, but I think that should be its own book, and it should be small and full of images.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Let's
write one together.
We're just going to start writing books and doing videos now.
Yeah, when my kids stop hanging off I'm not going to kick her off. I'm breastfeeding right now, so it's very hard to get anything done.
Oh.
It's okay.
It's okay.
In a few years.
It's a short window of time.
Yeah. All right. Hope you enjoyed that. Bitcoin Clarity, Kiara Bickers.
And let's maybe do a video on my channel too, if I keep you for a little bit.